guys, I'm so happy you decided to watch this video on sectionalism. We're going to get right to it real quick. What is sectionalism? Sectionalism is when you love your region, your section, more than the entire country. It's the opposite of nationalism. If you remember correctly, after the War of 1812, the United States had a really strong sense of nationalism, pride for our country. We loved it. We defended ourselves against Britain. And so eventually, though, over time, that nationalism started to separate into sectionalism. And we started getting three distinct sections, three regions of the United States. And they were the northern, or the north, which is up here, guys, all around the Great Lakes and the East Coast, all the way up to the Midwest. Okay, that became your north, your section, your northern section. You then had your southern section over here. So part of the East Coast also, but all the way going into the west up to Texas and the Panhandle. So that is another section that came about. And finally, the largest section, of course, was the west, all the way to the Pacific coast where California is at. So why did these sections arise? What caused them to form into these sections? And what made them create this division right here? You know what I mean? How did this become the northern section? How did this become the southern? And likewise the western section. So this is what I want you guys to always remember. Remember our equation. C plus G equals E. That is an equation that we've been talking about. Yes, math in history. Because if you know that C plus G equals E, that is the reason why we have sectionalism. C means climate. G means geography, and E is economics or economy. So because of the nation or that section's climate plus their geography, that determined their economy. That let us know what they were going to be doing for a living. So because of their climate and their geography, that made their economy. And because of those three things, those similar characteristics, that created their section, their region of the United States. So let's really just get into this. Let's talk about the North and what their C plus G ended up making their E. So their C for the North. The North, if we recall from the colonies, from colonization, the North had cold weather and rocky soil. And so because of their cold weather and rocky soil, they couldn't grow crops to make a living off of. That means they weren't growing cash crops. They can only grow enough for sustainability. That means to be able to feed their families and themselves and to survive. So all along here, all along the East Coast, they had to think of other things to do to make a living. So they looked at their climate. They looked at their geography and what was around them, and they said, you know what? There's an abundance of natural resources here. We have fast-flowing rivers. We have a lot of trees, timber, lumber. We're on a coast, and if we're on a coast, the East Coast, that means we can do fishing, we can go do some whaling, and that's going to allow us to create these port cities. These natural harbors were already there, like Boston, like New York City that eventually came about. So because of that, that started to create their region of the North. Now, in addition to all that, eventually, as time progressed, and they started to become an industrial nation. And what I mean by that is they started to manufacture goods. They started to make clothing. Textile mills started to come up. And because of that, the United States in the North, this section became an industrial nation. It started to become urbanized, and that means more cities. Why? Because they had more jobs. The factories had jobs to offer. So all of those things, I want you guys to think of this section having a bucket. And I have that bucket, and in that bucket, I have certain things that go in it, okay? I have a total of 3 buckets. This name of this bucket is the north, the name of this bucket is the south, and the name of this one is the west, okay? Now I want you to tell me, what are things that names, words, terms that I'm going to put in this bucket titled the north? I'm going to put things like urbanization, fast flowing rivers, cold weather, rocky soil. I'm going to put timber, fishing, whaling, shipbuilding. I'm going to put manufacturing, industries. How about people? What kind of people did we have there? Let's think of the human geography and what kind of individuals are we going to put in this bucket titled the North? We're going to be putting things, people like immigrants, because the immigrants were coming from Europe, and where's our busiest seaport? In New York City, right? And so all these immigrants were coming from Europe, and this is the first part that they were landing, they were hitting, and a lot of them were settling here. We had Irish immigrants. We had German immigrants in the Midwest. Why? Because in the Midwest, they had small farms, and that's what they came for. And eventually, they were able to ship their goods through the Erie Canal. Which connected Lake Erie to the Hudson River in New York, to eventually open up to the mouth of the ocean, right? Which is the Atlantic Ocean. So I want you guys to always think of it like that. Think of having a bucket and what words, what terms would go in that bucket titled the North, okay? They did not have a lot of slave labor in the North. It wasn't needed. They used as labor, their labor force was young women and children in the factories. That was their main labor force, okay? So they were anti-slavery in the North. And that started happening because, as well, of their C plus G equals E. They didn't have plantations. They didn't have cash crops. So there wasn't really a dependability on slave labor. So that's how things started to emerge. That's how those regions and these lines started to cut across what is the United States and form their regions. Eventually, over time, you get what is the North, right? Now, the North always also had one thing, and this is the last thing I'm going to discuss when it comes to the North. They also were pro-tariffs. Now, pro means they're for it. They want it. They agree with it. And tariff is a tax on imported goods. Now, this is a really difficult idea to understand, but if we understand the concept, then you'll be able to understand everything having to do with it, guys. First of all, the North was an industrial nation. Factories, they're manufacturing goods. The idea is that the South should buy those manufactured goods from the North so that our economy can be going, can be rotating, right? The money can be staying in the United States. Well, the South prefers to buy from Europe. Europe has been an industrial nation for a long time. And so instead of buying from the North, they're buying from Europe because it's cheaper. And so our money, our American money, is going to Europe. We don't want that. So what did America decide to do? What was our plan? Our plan was to tax imported goods. That's a tariff. So every time someone decided to buy a manufactured good from Europe, on their way in, they had to pay an additional tax. So that way, either you choose not to buy from Europe and the money stays here in America, or if you do continue to buy from Europe, at least we're getting money off that tax you have to pay. So the North was happy about that because they're the ones manufacturing the goods. They weren't buying from Europe because they're making those goods. So now they feel a little protected. Why? Because now at least some people are choosing not to buy from Europe and to buy from them. So they're pro-tariffs. They're for the tax on imported goods. Can we assume or infer what the South might be? They're going to be anti-tariffs. But we're going to discuss the South in a bit. That's everything you need to know about the North and sectionalism and how they started to love their section more than the entire country. In addition, there's one more thing. Like we mentioned, they were anti-slavery. So a lot of our abolitionists and the abolitionist movement, people against slavery wanting to end it, they were in the North. So people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, they were the ones really making a move to try to end slavery. So that abolitionist movement really took momentum in the North. So let's now move on and let's complete a couple of language frames on the North, guys, just so that it solidifies that information we just talked about. Now, starting from colonial time period, let's think about how their climate and their geography determined their economy. Their climate in the South, okay, hot weather, and that's their climate. And what about their geography? They had super flat land, so that's already giving you a big hint. And they had really good fertile soil. So what do you think they're going to do to make money? Think about John Smith, Pocahontas, right? And so we should be talking about tobacco. That became their cash crop when the Virginia Company of London first arrived, thinking they were going to be tripping over gold, and they couldn't. They didn't find any gold, but they ended up finding tobacco, and tobacco became their gold, guys. And so eventually they started to build these plantations all across the United States. And over time, as the North became an industrial nation, the South continued with plantations, but instead of tobacco, the main thing became cotton. Cotton became king. That's what they started to export. That's what they were growing a lot of. And guess what? Do you think cotton is going to be able to be picked by machines at that time? No. They need a lot of slave labor. I mean, a ton of slave labor. And so we start thinking about the South, and it became an agrarian nation. That's agriculture. So our bucket is titled the South. I'm putting words like flat, fertile soil, hot weather, plantation system, pro-slavery, for slavery, right? So I'm putting slave labor. I'm putting, did I say agriculture? Cultivation of cotton. Cultivation isn't a word that I want you guys to always keep in mind. That means they're growing it. They're growing a lot of cotton. And it starts to spread and spread. Now, there's another thing that we already discussed that made slavery spread even more drastically. And what do you think that invention was? During the Industrial Revolution, it was the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. Now, Eli Whitney had already invented interchangeable parts in the North and revolutionized, the factory system with assembly lines and all that stuff. Now, he also invented the cotton gin for the South. And the cotton gin, what it did was you'd put cotton in it, and then you'd kind of crank this lever, and it would clean or kind of pull apart the cotton so that the seeds fell to the bottom. And instead of having, 30, 40 slaves, picking the seeds out of the cotton, now you just needed one or two there handling, throwing the cotton in, cranking that lever, and cleaning it. But that doesn't mean that we eliminated slavery. It means that it spread, because guess what? We need more slaves cultivating that cotton out in the fields. So the cotton gin really, really expanded slavery in the South. So if we're thinking about C plus G equals E, their climate, hot, flat, fertile soil, climate and geography determine their economy, cash crops, plantation system, agriculture, all of that. And so if that's what you're doing for a living, then that's your section, that's your region. And so we've got Texas, we've got Missouri, we've got, of course, Virginia, Jamestown, where tobacco became our cash crop. And we've got all the South down here, and cotton became king as it continued to spread to the West. So all of those words we need to keep in mind, guys. In addition to the South area, the Southern area, we've got Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is where Andrew Jackson relocated the Native Americans during the Indian Removal Act and caused the Trail of Tears from Georgia all the way up to Oklahoma. So keep those things in mind as well. In Florida, you had the Seminoles, and the Seminoles put up a fight, guys. They put up a fight for a long time, the Seminole Wars, but they still eventually lost. Just like the Cherokee put up a fight, they did the right thing and took them to court, went all the way to the Supreme Court under Worcester versus Georgia, and John Marshall ruled in favor of them and said, you know what, Cherokee, you do not have to leave. And Jackson, King Jackson, being the president that he was, in charge of the military, said, no, we're going to evict you either way. We found gold there. We want to open those lands to white settlement as well. Go ahead and go, and we're going to force you to go to Oklahoma. And a quarter of the Cherokee Nation passed away, guys, died along the way. And that's why it was known as the Trail of Tears. So I just wanted you guys to know that. But always keep those things in mind. And that's why the South, they started to love their country, their section, more than their country. Because they felt like, hey, this is our way of living. And if the North wants to end slavery, you want to end my way of living? If you want to get rid of slavery and make it illegal, you're taking away my property and my living, my way of life. And so they started to love their section more than their entire whole country because they started to see other sections as enemies. All right? So that's everything that has to do with the South, guys. In addition, I want you guys to always keep these things in mind, okay? Think of a progression between the North on the top and the South and the bottom. So think of these colors: blue, green, red, and think of them starting and going like that. Blue, cold weather; green, warm weather, moderate weather; red, hot weather. Okay? And aside from that, that's climate. Let's think of geography. On the top, we've got mountains. And then in the middle, we've got rolling hills. And then in the bottom, in the South, flat land. So think of that as it goes. Okay? As we're going over it. Think of slave labor. No slavery. Some slavery. Yes, slavery. A lot. See slavery. A lot of slave labor. So keep those things in mind as we're going, and that'll always help you understand what kind of words you're going to put in the northern buckets and in the southern buckets. Okay. Now let's fill out a couple of language frames to really solidify this information, guys. Hey guys, we're nearing the end. Now we're discussing the West, all of this area right here. And when it comes to the West, I just want to kind of throw out some important things that had happened throughout history. And first of all, the West is what is their perspective on everything that's going on? Remember that the North and the South are against each other. There's that sectional tension that's occurring because of many things, because of their dependability, the South on slave labor. The North, who was against slavery, right? A lot of abolitionists. The tariff situation, pro-tariff, for tariffs, the North, anti-tariffs, the South. Well, what about the West? What's their whole perspective on this? I want you guys to just think about the West being kind of like, well, whatever, you know what I mean? Some people were for slavery, some were not. They were so far away and disconnected that there wasn't necessarily this strong sense of sectionalism for the West. But we are going to talk about some important things that when we think of a bucket of and labeling it the West, what are some things that will go in that bucket? Starting with the whole idea of manifest destiny, moving west, acquiring more land. We started to acquire all this land through different modes, different ways. The Louisiana Purchase, through an actual purchase when Thomas Jefferson was president. We acquired Oregon as a treaty with Britain when we divided that land and got all this land right here And it was the first time we actually reached the Pacific Ocean. So really, really important milestone for the United States. Going a little further down to the south, when we talk about the Mexican cession, this occurred under the U.S.-Mexican War. And in 1848, America acquired all this land that we have here, including very valuable California, because a year later, in 1849, they find gold in California. And so people start to rush from the east over to the west, known as the California Gold Rush. And because of this gold rush, that really had people coming over from the United States, but also immigrants as well. So we did have some Irish coming over, some German as well, but the main population were Chinese immigrants. And the reason why I want to talk to you guys about the Chinese and why they were mostly saturated here in the West, in the Pacific coast, is because the Chinese didn't come through the Atlantic Ocean and then cross all of the United States to get to the West. They said, you know what? They're in the continent of Asia, right? So instead of coming and crossing all of Asia and all of Europe, then the Atlantic, then the United States to get here, think of the world being round, right? Well, it is, but the world is round. They decided to come through the Pacific Ocean right here. So they crossed the Pacific and landed here in the coast, the west coast of the United States. And so they came because of the economic boom, right? Because of the California gold rush. They were leaving because of poverty and political disorder that was over there. And they came and they settled here. Now, those that didn't strike it rich, which most didn't, in the California gold rush, they had to go find another mode of work, right? Another way to work. And most of our Chinese immigrants, our labor force, went to work in the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad connected the east to the west, opening new markets, new commercial markets, really focusing on the free enterprise system. And so we also, because of this, and because the Chinese were saturated here, there was a lot of them, they started to create distinct communities, one of which we have Chinatown. You go in there and it's like you feel like you're in China. Why? Because of these immigrants settled and ended up staying here in this area. Other human geography, Salt Lake City, Utah. You see this little blue smudge? It's actually a lake in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah. And who were the people living there? Why do we need to know about them? Well, during this time, you have this religious group called Mormons who are living in the East. And they're getting persecuted. Remember, the word persecution stands for being punished because of your beliefs, your religious beliefs. And Mormons believed in polygamy. They practiced polygamy. They were polygamists, meaning poly, many. So they had many wives. And when they were over here, they were being persecuted. And so they decided to leave. And they left and they crossed the United States to the west and they settled in Salt Lake City, Utah. The West had inexpensive land, guys, that attracted a lot of people to go and start making small farms of their own to survive. So they had inexpensive land, the idea of a new life and a new opportunity, a new beginning to life. So a lot of art people like Thomas Cole, they romanticized the West as well, you know, with these beautiful landscape paintings of the West. So when you think of the West, guys, think of a bucket and all those things that go in that bucket having to do with the West, okay? So let's complete this graphic organizer, these language frames that we have next, okay?